Welcome back to the Groundless Ground podcast, the leading edge of integrative mental health. I'm your host, Lisa Dale Miller. You can subscribe to, download, and review the Groundless Ground on iTunes, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, and of course, find out more at groundlessground.com. I'm ready to go. How about you? Describing what is ultimately indescribable, that which transcends language, is really challenging. Yet psychologist John Astin accomplishes this daunting task so beautifully in his new book, This Extraordinary Moment. And John and I try our best in this rich dialogue to entice you into a process of profound inquiry into non-dual reality and its usefulness in psychotherapeutic contexts for going beyond suffering, enlivening inner freedom, and generating systemic well-being. I could not think of a better person to do this with. A lifelong meditation practitioner, John has had a long career in health psychology research on mind-body interventions and continues to teach in graduate psychology programs. This dialogue was a real treat for me. May it inspire you to land in the timeless wisdom of experience as it is. It's just amazing to have you here.
Happy to be here.
I didn't know that you had published a new book, and it's fabulous. I'm not sure who wrote the blurb on your website about your book, but there's one sentence in there that I just wanted to start with because it's so great. This extraordinary moment invites you on a journey of boundless inquiry, which becomes a liberating free fall into the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding of lived reality, which words can never quite describe. So here we go. You and I are going to try to use words.
Exactly. Well, that was, of course, a central challenge of the book. The entire book is really about what that passage you just read says, which is what's happening here, experience, reality, whatever we want to call it, is beyond comprehension. I mean, literally, it's beyond our ability to encapsulate it with words and concepts. And yet, this is a medium through which we human creatures seem to communicate. And so I'm trying to use words in my writing and my work to convey that, to somehow evoke that understanding, or really, as much as anything, invite an investigation and inquiry into what's going on here.
So the word here, I think you and I might be talking about experience itself.
Yes. As far as I can tell, there isn't anything else to talk about, because that's what we've got. This is what we have to explore, is what's happening experientially. I mean, we can certainly talk about ideas and abstractions, and that's fine, but where the juice is in experience itself. This is it. What's so remarkable, and I write about a lot in the book, is that we're just kind of walking around, really, it's all quite innocent. This is all reality's doing, if you will. The doing of consciousness, the doing of reality. I don't know how to even put that, but what we do, what consciousness does, is it's constantly generating these interpretations of what's here, what's happening experientially. So we're kind of walking around innocently enough with the belief that we actually know what's going on here, because we have this extraordinarily rich vocabulary and ways of seemingly framing it and interpreting it and characterizing what's going on here. That's the trick, is that we just think we know what's going on. A little investigation begins to reveal that there's a lot more going on than we think. I wanted to call the book It's Not What You Think It Is, and I still like that title better. I love that because it's such a common human expression. Oh, it's not what you think it is. It really encompasses the heart of what I'm trying to convey, which is that this is not what we think it is. It's always more than what we think it is.
So I want to give a little context for you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure people are thinking, is this guy a philosopher? What is this? You have a doctorate in health psychology. You did your fellowship at Stanford University School of Medicine. And for many years, you were in the health research field. You've published over 50 scientific papers, mostly on mind-body medicine practices, particularly MBSR. And you've been dealing with the human mind in not just a conventional psychological way for many, many years. You're still a professor, I think, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So when you write the kind of book that you wrote, where you are attempting, and I might say, doing a really good job of describing the indescribable experience of mind. I think it's important for the listeners to know that you are not somebody who's just conjecturing about mind. You're somebody who's actually worked in the field of clinical psychology and doing this, what I call translational psychology.
It's been a long, wonderful journey, of life, of exploring the nature of reality, if you will, through all these different threads of my life, through psychology, through my art and my music, through my research, through my work with people, through my writing. Because I've been involved in many different spiritual traditions as part of all of this. My desire was to try to use language in a way that was not laden with a lot of esoterica. I mean, even though I've obviously had influences from a lot of different traditions, including Buddhism, I think you could read my book and not even know in some ways that I had those influences. I tried to keep that esoteric language out of it so that it would hopefully be accessible to anybody, even spiritually naive people, in the sense of not having been steeped in a lot of spiritual practice or non-dual traditions. For example, I introduce it to my grad students, and I have been over the last couple of semesters. They got some early drafts of the book. It's like a test to see what happens if I introduce these pretty, you could say, radical notions into minds that are not familiar with that kind of investigation. And it's interesting. It's still an ongoing experiment to see like what happens when I do that. It's just provocative to start to consider that the way we've been conceptualizing what's happening here is really only part of the story. Although I do make a link in the book and in my graduate classes with some concepts in psychology that have been emerging over the last decade in particular, most notably cognitive fusion and cognitive diffusion. That's a very kind of understandable and accessible notion. And the basic idea for listeners, if they're not familiar with it, is that we could say, like, let's make it very simple. Something's happening, let's call it experience, and then consciousness generates interpretations and frames of reference about what's happening. We could say our cognitions about what's happening, our conceptualization of it. Cognitive fusion points to our belief that we, other people, the world is what we think it is, essentially. So we become fused with our thoughts. If I'm in relationship with you, you're a friend of many years, I carry around with me a whole set of conceptual maps about who you are. They're implicit. Digging up my map of Lisa to figure out who she is, I just carry them around as kind of, oh yeah, I kind of know who you are. Even all the way down to my imagining that you're a human being and a woman, because those are also conceptual maps. And I'm not saying they're wrong, and that's a very important thing. And nowhere am I even suggesting that the way we think about life is somehow wrong, but it's partial and it's untrue in the sense of my ideas, say, to come back to the example of you, my ideas of who you are, they can barely capture who you are. There's too much there. There's too much complexity to you. There's too much subtlety to who you are. There's too much information there. So my ideas are going to be very crude oversimplifications, overgeneralizations of who and what Lisa is. Cognitive fusion represents my notion, my belief that you essentially are who I think you are. And cognitive diffusion, which we hear people like in the mindfulness worlds and acceptance commitment therapy worlds, most notably, talking about cognitive diffusion and these different contemplative practices that people argue can help people defuse from their thinking. But really the book, in a sense, is my writings, and my really what I can't stop seemingly writing and teaching about right now is exploring the way in which our actual experience of the world, of ourselves, of other people, transcends in every instant whatever we imagine it is. From my standpoint, that turns out to be liberating to discover that. We're not really caught in experience. We're caught in our ideas about what it is, I would say.
I'm so glad you went to cognitive fusion, mostly because this is what I do all day long in the room with my patients,
Mm-hmm.
is allowing them to have direct experience of their assumptiveness, largely because the brain is lazy. You know, the 6 layers of the prefrontal cortex have all this information, images. When information comes in, it
Mm-hmm.
feed forwards out about 6 times more information because it's actually much more readily willing to go look around in the files it already has, figure out what it's experiencing. That's a process that we do because it would be, frankly, exhausting for a human organism. to have to be present in a conceptual way all the time. What I love about your book is that you really start to deconstruct and tease apart the different ways in which we are present in our experience, shifting the point of view of awareness to land in more of what actually is. At one point in your book, you actually say, if I had to sum up the central theme of this book, I would do so with the following phrase: this is it.
Yeah, I love the word this because it's not an esoteric word. It doesn't reference this being absolute reality or this being God or this being consciousness. It's just this, what's here, what's present. I don't use it in the book, but I've lately been playing around with this metaphor. I'll just share it with you because it's coming to mind now. If you say this, and let's just call it experience is another good word for this. I could say many things, a conversation on a computer, in a room, with color and light and sound. And all of this is sort of the field of experience, the field of this, the field of what's happening, of which I immediately have an instantaneous cataloging and categorizing and characterizing of what this apparently is. What I've been saying lately is, like, if we think about this, we think about experience as a two-sided coin. And we say on one side of the coin, we have just the raw presence of this, the raw presence of experience. And then on the other side of the coin, we have our interpretation of what it is, our descriptions of what it is. For example, if I focus in on what I call the body, there's an experience there. That's one side of the coin. And that experience is then described as body. It's labeled as body. If you look at all the ways we label on that side of the coin, we label what's going on here. The question I'm asking people to explore is, what are those labels actually referring to? So when I say body, what am I describing? Now, a lot of people, when I say that, will immediately go to some sort of analytical, oh, well, the body is this construction of cells and molecules. And no, that's not what I'm talking about, because that's more description. I'm talking about what is it that we're actually describing. I say, well, how are you doing today, Lisa? And you say, well, I'm feeling tired. You just characterized an experiential event. Of course, it's ongoing. It's not static. This is one of the amazing things about the experience side of the coin is nothing's static. Everything is alive. Everything is dynamic. But anyway, we use language and we describe flash moment in time. I'm tired. Then the question I'm inviting people to explore is, what is tired as a experience? That's the question, is what is going on here? Not as an idea, but as a direct experience. That turns out to be an extraordinarily rich exploration, and ultimately one for which there is no answer, as far as I can tell. We don't come up with an answer because this doesn't collapse into an answer. It's bottomless, it's fathomless, it's not resolvable as being something. I never use the word anywhere in the book, emptiness, but that's, to me, my understanding of emptiness, is that this does not resolve. This is indeterminate. It can't be collapsed into some notion, some framework, because it's infinite. And that can sound very abstract, but actually it's the opposite of abstract. It's actually the fact of our experience. It's what experience feels like. Experience feels bottomless. It has no end to it.
So some of the words that you're using might feel to people unapproachable, like bottomless. If someone comes to you and they tell you they just feel empty. You and I both know that when they use the word empty, they are not describing what all the schools of Buddhism describe as empty. If we say bottomless, people can feel as though there's no ground.
Yeah.
Which, in fact, you and I know there is no ground. Groundless, to me, is more of a horizontal expansion rather than this free fall into some bottomless pit, which on a conceptual, psychological, and affective feeling level causes human beings to want to grasp at something. So I'm mentioning this because, rewind back a little bit, what you and I haven't really said yet. As human beings, we have a penchant for meaning. We need meaning, which means we need to make something of things. We need them to be something special. When you invite people over and over again in your book to drop into direct experience, it appears as though what happens is they are meeting the ordinariness.
Just a moment ago, I was saying that this doesn't collapse down into some sort of conceptual framework. The categories of ordinary or extraordinary, those don't apply in a certain way. We can use those to describe, like today was just kind of an ordinary day, kind of like similar to other days. Or my God, it was just extraordinary. That's fine. I mean, that's part of the human experience. Is reality is radically inclusive of everything. So all the descriptions can be included. But at the same time, we can feel what's here. Like, okay, so this moment that's appearing right now, this moment, because we have nothing else really to talk about, this moment, is it ordinary? It's wildly beyond all such formulations. Same thing with meaning. It's like, is this meaningful or meaningless? Those don't apply. Those are conceptual formulations. If I feel what's here, it simply is. And the existence of this instant, however I might be characterizing it, the sheer raw presence of it, the existence of it, the aliveness of it is beyond comprehension.
But it is feelable.
Well, I would suggest that that's all we're ever feeling. We're always feeling something. Something is always present. That's I write in the book about. It's like presence is ever present. Something's always present. It's always different. This is the diversity of reality. It's like it always looks different, always shows up with a different radiance, a different shine, a different manifestation, a different texture, a different color. But it's always present. That's the relentlessness of it. And how do we know something's always present? Because it's being felt. We're feeling the presence of what's here. I'm sharing the perspective of this radical, raw, what is the felt sense of this? What is the feeling of this moment? As a feeling, not as a description. Whatever I might come up with descriptively, oh, it feels heavy or it feels open, I can come right back to the same inquiry. Okay, open. What's open feel like? I'm blown away by this constantly because I call it the magic show of reality. Take the most ordinary of human experiences, like the taste of a certain food. The taste of chocolate is definitely something, isn't it? It's got a presence to it. It's got a signature to it. It's like it's chocolate, it's not vanilla. Okay, so I can make that distinction experientially. Now, if I were to ask, what is the taste of chocolate actually as an experience?
Well, my philosopher friends would tell you you're now talking about qualia. They don't like
Yeah.
qualia anymore as a term.
That's what we're in, is qualia. We're in the texture of experience. That's what we're swimming in. That's what we are, in a sense. Why that has pragmatic utility among also just being an amazingly rich, luscious inquiry is that when somebody comes to you or somebody who's working with people in some capacity and they find themselves struggling with some state of mind or experience or circumstance, which is why they're coming to you, of course. I don't mean to minimize human suffering by any stretch, but we could say in many ways that we're defining those things into existence in a sense. In other words, take something like anxiety. That's a description of a negative mind state. And then I have additional elaborations on top of that, which is, I don't like it. I wish it would go away. What's wrong with me because I'm having this experience? But what is the actual thing that all those elaborations are referring to that apparently is a problem that I should go to a therapist to get rid of? What is it actually? Sometimes I ask that question, people look at me like, what kind of question is that? But I don't know, to me, it just seems like, aren't you curious? Like, you have a name for it. Let's investigate what that word is referring to in experience. And I would suggest what it's referring to is energy. I could use words like information. I could use words like sensation. But again, I don't know what those words are exactly referring to either, even though I have the words. They're apparently pointing to something experientially. Where that leaves me whenever I look at that is I'm in this wide open mystery. It's a remarkable thing to discover. And in a certain way, it's as simple as, I say it's as simple, and maybe that's naive to say it that way, but it's simply feeling what's here.
Could you do that?
Yeah. Well, you can keep your eyes open or closed. It doesn't really matter. Just feel your own self here, your own being. Feel the fact of existence, the fact that something's here, that life is here. It's really just feeling here-ness, feeling aliveness. rest in that aliveness, that presence of beingness, presence of you, the life, the reality that you are here, letting yourself be nourished by your own being. And feel the way in which that just can't really be said what that is. It's beyond words. And yet it's palpable, it's concretely here, this feeling that I'm calling life, existence. But just let yourself fall into that. Drop into the well of your own being. It's just a wide open, edgeless, borderless field of being. It feels very local, probably very much here, but that here turns out to have no edges to it. That was nice.
Wonderful. That is the actuality of what people do when they go beyond notions that they're so fixated on about experience.
Mm-hmm.
And very liberating to be able to have a clinician not focus on your story about what you're experiencing, but instead to cut through the narrative that you're so fixated on and ask you to go directly experience what you think is anxiety. Hands down, every time what people find is first, there's no such thing as anxiety. There's a bunch of thoughts that really bother them, drive the nervous system into states that don't feel good, causes all kinds of internal organs and muscles and tissues to do things that don't feel good. Once they are experiencing that, the body's so excited that the mind is actually with it that the body just starts to unwind all of that naturally. And then people start to feel relief. And they don't understand it at first. They have no idea how that can happen because they're conditioned to this self, this ego, this mind has to make everything happen top down. Experience itself before you get to the wide open indescribable. The step before that appears to be, wow, I'm an organism in a world and there's so much freedom here. The 10% I think is directing everything, in fact, is not.
Right.
There's a huge world here with an amazingly mysterious and complex organism doing so many things I'm not even aware of, that when I become aware of them, everything becomes, what did you call it?
The magic show of
The
phenomena.
magic show.
Yeah.
And underlying that is the aliveness and the energy that we both, I think, will agree is boundless.
The implications are pretty radical because they are so contrary to what we think is going on. Language and conceptualization, conventional reality suggests that things have duration. That this moment, what's going on, I'm sitting in a room on a computer, that all things, including you and me, have some degree of stability from moment to moment. Like you are the same person you were an instant ago.
I appear to be because we have an illusion of continuance. It's built into us.
It's interesting if you look at that question of continuity, if we actually just feel what's here, we can feel that it's not holding still. It's very obvious, actually. It doesn't take 30 years on a cushion to see that this has no permanence. It's dynamic, it's alive. How does something that's alive have continuity? It doesn't. It's arising and passing away, morphing into some new version of itself in every instant. That's an extraordinary thing because that's true of all of our experience. So any notions we have of who and what we are, identity, what do you mean identity? Which identity? The one now or the one in the next instant? So there's nothing fixed. Experiences and language that describes those experiences suggest durationality and continuity. But if I'm experiencing this thing called grief or sorrow or anxiety. That's alive. What version of it am I describing? Whatever we're grasping hold of and attempting to define and identify as, oh, that's what that is gone, up in smoke, just like that. In that sense, it's not a stretch to say this cannot be described, because we can only describe what was, because what is too alive, it's too instantaneous, it's too now. I don't think that's philosophy. I think that that's experience. It's a trick of consciousness that does a very simple kind of, well, who knows how consciousness does this, because like you said, there's all these things that the body mind is doing over which we have no clue how it's doing it. It's somehow doing a quick kind of assessment of, yeah, you know what, this moment is more or less like the previous moment. And so I have this sense of continuity and durationality. But actually, what I have is,
when you snap your finger and you say this,
mhm,
like that,
mhm.
that is an experience that a person, the snap, you can know that you heard the snap, and you can know that the snap comes and goes fast,
Very fast, yes.
right? You can even hear the snap and have an affective feeling. But what most people do is and then what they do is get caught up in all the associative stories about
Yeah.
snapping. And then what happens is it appears as though the concepts, likes and dislikes about the snap, is the thing that we get lost in.
Right. Well, can I ask you a question related to your podcast? Something you were saying earlier about this groundlessness, and that there's a way in which, if I heard you right, you were kind of suggesting that, at least for many people, if not most people, that kind of discovery of the groundless, bottomless, if you will, nature of this would be very disorienting, cause people to become frightened. Let's just say that we seem to be seeking for some ground, for some sense of stability and security. And so we're, in a sense, creating that through our descriptions and our definitions. So we create the sense of stability, but actually what's going on is radical instability. There's not continuity experientially. To me, the ground that it's in your title of your podcast is the groundlessness.
Mm-hmm.
That's the stability, actually. That's what we can rely on. It sounds kind of weird to say that, but what we can count on is the fact that this can't be counted on. We can count on the fact that this is slipping away instant by instant. And that's actually a firm ground because it's actuality. It's not imagination. The imagination tells us, oh, yeah, this is ongoing and I'm more or less who I was a moment ago. And that, no, you're actually not. We're getting on board with the way things are, which is this instability, this ungraspability, this groundlessness. And my experience of that is that's relieving rather than frightening. I want to know what this is. I want to have certainty about what's going on here, right? Because that gives me a feeling of like, ooh, I know the score. I know what's going down here. I got my philosophy. I got my metaphysics. I got my cosmology. I got my religion. I got my politics. But actually, those things are flimsy as hell because they can't encompass what's here. So in a sense, the unknowability of this turns out to be our real ground and our real stability, not our knowledge.
For me, presence in the phenomenality of experience is not frightening. That is an experience that allows a sense of deep relief. This is the experience clinically in the room that I have with patients. They shift their attention to either the surround or something that's actually occurring in their bodily experience from the point of view of the nervous system, from the point of view of the organism. It's incredibly relieving.
Right.
And there is a sense of great comfort and stability because they're finally here. In fact, you have a quote. It says, "Here appears effortlessly. Nothing need be done to create or sustain it. It is relentlessly present." And that quote from your book, to me, describes what is the groundless ground. People like us in the clinical world are essentially folding back the delusion and pointing to something that probably at some point in our evolution, human beings experienced more readily. I'm an organism on the planet doing my daily existence. I have to pay attention to the world around me because I'm much more reliant on it
Hmm.
than we modern humans are. We live in our minds. Everything is done for us. Your book, in some ways, is an antidote. It's a prescription to come back to some way of humanness that is much more whole.
We're talking about it as if there's two sort of separate realities. There's the reality of all the describing and all the elaborating, and then there's the direct, raw experience. But what's so fascinating is that, as far as I could tell, it's a single reality. We live in a worded world, a described world, and we live in a wordless, non-conceptual, indescribable reality simultaneously. We are that transcendental, indescribable field of energy and intelligence and ungraspable, unnameable, all that. We're that, and we're still able to function in the way that we function as human beings at the same time. And so all I'm really saying, bring a little attention to this other perspective. I am a human being living a human existence in time and space. But from another perspective, none of those things are the case. None of those things can really describe what's here. It's not an either or. It's a radical inclusivity of all possible perspectives.
I have become a mundanist. If I'm able to just live each moment as it's coming up, any thoughts that I have about it are thoughts. They're fine. They're not actually a problem. Thoughts in and of themselves are not a problem. They're just more phenomena.
Yeah.
I try to tell people, your thoughts are not a problem. This is one of my big beefs with CBT, frankly. It's a fixational antidote for a fixational problem. So
Right.
thoughts are there, my feelings are there, the experience is there. What mental health to me is dependent upon is my capacity to rest in all of it, have some insight about the nature of it so that
Mm-hmm.
at the forefront of my action around it and with it, I
Mm-hmm.
always have the capacity to remain in an intention of non-harming, no matter what. So there's enough presence on board with the phenomenality of life to realize that I am not the master controller.
Mm-hmm.
Things are going to happen around me, and I'm going to have to be flexible. I'm going to have to be able to meet them with a sense of deep intention about how I want to be in it and the way I want to manifest in this world. Intention is something you talked about in your book as well.
Inquiring into agency and choice. The ordinary human perspective is that we have free agency and free choice. So there's explorations in the book that call that into question and look at the whole notion of agency. We can't really explain where our intentions and motivations come from. Where are they arising from? Why do you want what you want? Are you intending it, or is it here as an appearance, as an inexplicable reality? Why is Lisa the way Lisa is? Why is John the way John is? From that standpoint, it doesn't feel as if I'm choosing to be who I am. I am who I am. In another way, as you talked about embodying this kind of presence with what is, with the felt sense of experience, it feels as if we're participants somehow in this. It isn't just happening to us. We're not like a passive person just like looking at this. It's alive. It's an unresolvable thing. If I just feel my experience right now, there's no lines of separation anywhere. And yet, from another perspective, it feels as if I am a subject navigating a world of objects and making choices in the flow and how I am in relationship with those objects. Those two realities, they coexist. They're both true somehow.
There's no reason to go find some ultimate nature. It's just this. For many people, that is a deeply disappointing place to go because I think a lot of people are looking for something that's so much bigger than their lives. And of course, that's because the egoic notions of who we are cause us to think there has to be something other than this.
The notion that this couldn't be it, that somehow this is not satisfactory enough, this is lacking in some way, all stems from our ways in which we're characterizing it and defining it. But if we feel what's here, this is anything but mundane. This is unthinkably rich and luscious and miraculous. And it's always that, no matter how I might be describing it. The raw presence is astonishing beauty and mystery and ungraspable. Well, it's bliss. but not bliss as opposed to the lack of bliss. It's the feeling tone of reality itself. If we simply are with what is, we simply be what is, which is maybe simpler than allowing it. Just be anxious, just be insecure. The vulnerability disappears.
The frame you're holding on to is gone, and then what's there is the thing itself, which is always so much better than what the mind is thinking it is.
It's an aspect of the totality showing up in that instant. Every instant, every moment is an interface point for that, because it's nothing but that. And that's an astonishing thing. It's always present as this, as each instant.
One of the things that I hear is a underlying fear that if I'm so present and so open all the time, how will I ever have any desire to do anything? What will motivate me? Because so many people are driven to do things by concepts about themselves that make them feel that they have to be something.
Sure.
So what would you say if someone said that to you?
If you're so inclined, do the experiment and find out for yourself what comes from that. Maybe you're telling yourself stories about what might happen if you open up to this sense of ever-present fullness. Ever-present fullness sounds like kind of a good deal. Our achievement and our doing of stuff as humans is coming out of this sense of we need to improve upon ourselves, improve upon the world, address the lack. What would it look like to have our life movement, our activities, our whatever we find ourselves gravitating towards in our lives and our work and our relationships, coming from a very natural place of nothing's missing? In other words, it's inclusive of everything. I might decide if to sit on a mountain for the rest of my life and do absolutely nothing but rest in the bliss of ever-present fullness. I might decide to create something or have a relationship or who knows what. That's very idiosyncratic, I think, depending on who we happen to be. The direct felt sense of what's here doesn't equate to any sort of notion of meaninglessness or nihilism. It's just, it's full. It's a radiance. And then I do whatever I do within the context of that. It's just coming to be at home with what is. And that's a good thing.
I'm going to throw a monkey wrench into all of this. By the way, I didn't detect this at all in your book. One of the problems that I have with people who do non-dual psychotherapy or they are following non-dual teachers, when they say that the basic aliveness and fullness is the nature of existence. I don't have any problem with anyone saying that, but I never hear them say that and then say dissatisfaction is part of the aliveness. When people like you and I have these conversations that people listen to, we make it very, very clear that all of these teachings are for one thing, which is when you're in a moment of distress, that moment of distress, its ultimate nature is this, what you call aliveness and effulgence. It doesn't cancel out the distress. You are still experiencing distress. On the other hand, there is a way of knowing the nature of distress that allows the system to not produce more distress.
I'll share an experience about that recently. Over the last several months, I experienced a very significant loss. I've lived a bit of a charmed life somehow. I didn't experience a lot of early trauma. I had amazing parents. But I encountered a degree of loss and grief that I actually didn't know was possible. And I was on my knees. But I had this golden opportunity, in a sense, to investigate that experience, and in the very much the ways I'm talking about with you today. Because on one side of that coin, that descriptive side of the coin, it was grief, it was heartbreak, it was loss. It was like, I really wouldn't wish it on anyone, kind of ready for this to end. Okay, all those descriptions. What is grief? This is what you teach. Let's check it out. In the Dzogchen tradition, they talk about the natural perfection, the great perfection of everything as it is.
We do.
That's what I got to be reminded of, is like, this is the natural perfection as it is. This is pure presence. This is reality shining forth as grief and heartbreak and loss. Not necessarily making the distress go away, but it recontextualizes it experientially. And suddenly, was it this terrible sense of loss and grief? Or was it the bliss of the ground of being? I literally mean that. I wasn't sure what it was. There were times where in the midst of feeling all of that, the human part of it, oh yeah, I know what this is, it's grief. And it's like, yeah, okay, well just feel feel into the presence of it, and then I'm thrust into the open-endedness of it, indeterminacy of it, the unresolvability of it. And that is so juicy. The first time I ever had what I would call like a big realization in my life that was really rocked my world and is continuing in a way to rock it. I would say that I saw that everything was, I think I might have put it in the terms of God at the time, but everything was this divinity, this sacredness. Everything means everything. Nothing's excluded from that. Even the most difficult thing I ever experienced was also that. And that's the great good news, because it means that we're never apart from it, because it's always present as our present experience.
In the Dzogchen tradition, they make it so people don't reify the groundless ground, which is very important. What they do is use a metaphor of a snake untying itself. All phenomena, internal and external, no matter what is arising, is of the nature to arise, exist, and pass away, which of course is the teaching of the historical Buddha. The way they describe it is that because all phenomena that manifests internally and externally has at its basis this essential aliveness, empty expanse, which just means all things occur unimpeded. Nothing is left out.
Right.
But the nature of the occurrences, like a snake that unties itself, they have as their nature the nature to unwind. When people have fixational attention on some kind of internal narrative about either themselves or the world, or even something external or something in their body, the liberation of that experience is only in the capacity to know directly that thing is of the nature to unwind itself.
Exactly. Self-liberation upon arising. Whatever it is we're imagining we need to let go of has already let go of itself, because that is its nature. Reality is the liberator. We just look at what reality is doing, and it's liberating itself in every instant. We get to start over again in every instant. This is what it does, brilliantly, effortlessly.
This is the ultimate intervention in order to liberate people from suffering.
So we see that we are liberated, that that is our very nature, that we're not bound. And the notion of being bound is it's also pure, a wide open, open-ended, ungraspable mystery. And whatever it is we imagine binding us is also not a thing. But it does seem that recognizing that benefits us. Even though from the absolute perspective, if you will, as they say in Dzogchen, recognition and non-recognition are equal. How do you know you're not recognizing the ground of being? Because clarity is shining forth. This is mindfulness. This is awareness shining as the presence of what is.
That mindfulness is king mindfulness. That's what they call it, to distinguish it from the mundane practices that must be done in order to achieve some kind of insight.
For me, it's an open question as to how much preparation is required for that kind of recognition of the king mindfulness. With my grad students, I'm just introducing them. They're getting trained in deliberate mindfulness. And I do the same thing when I talk about acceptance, because in our field, in psychology, acceptance-based methods, right? And I say, that's cool. You can practice learning to be more accepting of what's here. But there's something much bigger that has already allowed this moment to be as it is. And you don't have to work to make that happen. It's interesting to see with these young people that I'm teaching, the grad students, it just blows their mind. No one's ever introduced them to that notion that there's something intrinsic that is open to what's here, that is, shall we say, loving what's here, that is embracing, in the most radical, inclusive way, what's here.
Even in Dzogchen, continual practice has to be done in order to stabilize the experience.
It's just interesting to think about even the notion of stabilizing something called the experience of this or the recognition of this. This holds on to itself in a sense because it is itself. So there's no stabilizing this. There's just this, and it's self-sustaining.
So I can use your example of tense grief that you experienced. You had moments where you went in and out of recognition. Sometimes, I'm sure, you had moments where the grief was just all you were. You have the skill of being able to question that and to drop into some other kind of experience. You went back and forth between the two. That's how it is for almost all of us. I'm not a Buddha. And I know that the way this works is we drop in and out of recognition.
That is the nature of reality itself that does this, that seemingly loses itself in its reifications. Are you really lost? Because what we call being lost is pure presence.
I understand that this is ultimate need, but I also understand this is not people's direct experience.
You're right. It's paradoxical. It's one thing to say what I just said. It's another thing to come to know that more intimately as one's own nature.
There has to be some capacity to train the mind, especially a mind that has spent years in such a high level of distraction and upset. There has to be a set of tools available, both embodied tools as well as mind training tools, to allow that system to come back into some semblance of a condition in which it could settle. People must start where they are, and they have to be able to have someone meet them where they are. You can't meet them in the ultimate when there's no capacity on board to even be with the mundane. That's what I love so much about your book, the way you've encapsulated the indescribable. You started off with mainline, mainstream psychology. Here's the frame. Here's where you might be. And here's something else. You have an entire book full of short ways in which they can conceive of such a thing conceptually, and then the actual practical experience. Try this, do this.
Thank you for reminding me that what I was saying a few moments ago was kind of contradicting myself. But I do like to continually reinforce along the way of sharing any kinds of inquiry practices with people to recognize that it's not needed. Like meditation is a trick to realize that meditation isn't necessary, because meditation is reality.
Yes.
It's not something you do sitting on a cushion. It's this instant. The shining forth of this is meditation. But maybe sitting on a cushion, if it's done in a skillful, intelligent, sensitive way, can help to illuminate that. But the really profound experiences are ones that reveal that what's being looked for is present in all experience.
I agree. There is one point in your book, you talk about well-being in the flow of experience itself. Your grief story is a perfect example, right? This thing that you'd never experienced before that was just so intense. You found a way at some point to use that, to re-land back in this wisdom that you have so beautifully elucidated in your book. What better endorsement is there?
All I know is my experience. I say this to my grad students when I teach research methods, and we're psychologists and we're wanting to study human beings. I said, but there's a very interesting thing, which is we cannot know one another's experiences. We only know our own. I feel like you and I, we could talk for a long time about all this because it's just too much fun. Thanks for inviting me onto your show.
Such a profound conversation for me on so many levels, John. Being able to do the translational piece from the beautiful wisdom we both trained in and the applicability of it to clinical application. You were such a beautiful example of that. Thank you so much.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Go get the book. I promise you will not be disappointed. Thanks for listening to today's show. To get in touch, please visit groundlessground.com. Let's dedicate our efforts to the healing of our planet and all its inhabitants. See you next time on the Groundless Ground.